If you've clicked on this video, chances are you already know who this dashing cowboy hat wearing desperado is. The apparent savior of Star Wars, the alleged creator of Clone Wars, Rebels, Bad Batch, Tales of the Jedi, and the co-creator of The Mandalorian. In the years since his hiring at Lucasfilm, Dave Filoni has skyrocketed in popularity amid Star Wars fans, heaping on praise upon praise, claiming he can do no wrong, and here he is now as the head writer of Ahsoka, a show about a character he developed all the way back in 2008. The apprentice to Anakin Skywalker, the girl who fought Darth Maul, Darth Vader, and Destiny itself, outliving all common sense, corporate reshuffling, cancellation, and initial fan backlash, to where now Disney has given her and Dave Filoni their own TV show. Star Wars under Disney has been tumultuous, to say the least. You have the disappointing and bad sequel trilogy, mediocre Disney Plus shows, and several decisions to do with this franchise that make you wonder why the keys to one of the biggest, most revered film franchises was handled to a bunch of monkeys smearing mediocrity all over their typewriters. For it all though, Filoni has stood as one of the few bastions of quality in the last few years, bringing us Rebels, a show that added a lot to the universe and gave us some pretty great moments and characters that stand out amidst all the filler the show has. He was steering the ship, wrapping up Clone Wars, giving an end to a part of our childhoods that never got a proper send-off. We saw the aftermath, or heard through osmosis what happened, but we never got to see everything unfold. For the longest time, we had no idea what happened to Maul, or Ahsoka, or Rex, or how all these puzzle pieces set up over the course of years ended up falling into place. But under Filoni, we got that send-off. We saw things we always imagined, wanted to see, tied inseparably to the movies it was always a companion piece to. There was victory, there was death. The final episodes of Clone Wars stand tattooed in my memory. It was the perfect send-off to a show that I started in 2008 at 5 years old, and finished 12 years later, right on the cusp of adulthood. There was The Mandalorian, a show he co-created along with Jon Favreau, having a hand in several of the episodes, being a key creative voice behind what that show was, a natural progression of his career from animation to live action. And much like Clone Wars, there was victory in what Dave Filoni was able to accomplish, but there was also death. The Mandalorian exists as a weird subsect to Star Wars to me. On the one hand, I loved the show's early commitment to its aesthetic and its premise, bringing back that original creative spirit George Lucas had that created Star Wars as we know it today. Taking influence from movies, shows, and tales of old from his childhood and spinning that off into its own thing in a way that was familiar but wholly distinct. Mandalorian wasn't so much inspired by the idea of making a Star Wars show, but more so translating the influences of Star Wars into a format that it didn't before. Samurai, cowboys, mythology, tales of old past through the generations, that's what I adore about it. But on the other hand, I hate how spineless it is, not fully committing to that initial idea beyond the occasional surface level, dipping in and out of being an episodic serial or a show of a narrative and a story that spans a season. There's so much wasted time, so much wasted potential, setups for a lot of great ideas with payoff that leads nowhere. Then I look at Ahsoka, a show that's being headed by Dave Filoni completely and totally. No George Lucas, no co-writers, producers, or chef jerking off the props for 2 hours, it's all him. And what do you know, at 4 episodes in, I'm beginning to see a pattern. A great attention to aesthetic, spirit, and making connections to the past, but so far a story that feels bland. Something that sets up a lot of potentially interesting ideas only for it to be what it appeared to be. Dressing on something with a hollow center. And then that makes me go further down the rabbit hole. How much of Dave Filoni's good is Dave Filoni? Let me explain. Dave Filoni's start was on Clone Wars in 2008, hired on by George Lucas due to his work on Avatar: The Last Airbender as a director and his well-known love for Star Wars from everybody at the Nickelodeon offices. When developing Clone Wars, Lucas wanted somebody to direct the show that knew Star Wars, that didn't see the franchise as something cynical, as an excuse to make a cartoon that would sell toys. He needed somebody who understood his vision and what made Star Wars, who knew its influences, its motifs, its style, the who, what, and why behind the choices of all 6 films. And Filoni fit that bill. If you've ever listened to him talk about Star Wars, he speaks about it in a way that's fluent and impassioned, able to wax poetic for hours about the storytelling significance of uncommon, underrated moments from films that were at the time hated and reviled. His childhood wasn't solely comprised of Star Wars. His media diet growing up consisted of movies passed down from his father to him. Old Kurosawa, Star Trek, Godzilla, old parts of film history that go overlooked. As said earlier, he directed a lot of Last Airbender, a show that remixed Eastern influences of culture, style, and storytelling into its own distinct entity, which I think goes without saying what it made him a good candidate for. But Dave Filoni's role on Clone Wars was not as a writer. He wasn't sat by candlelight toiling away on scripting some of the show's best arcs. To say the show was created by him also seems to be a bit of a stretch. His role on Clone Wars was as a supervising director, someone who oversees the steering of the ship, ensuring everything's up to code, making certain that the crew working on the show were adhering to the core vision, not going off path and radically off course from what it was going to be. I am not a showrunner, I am not a producer, I have never ran coffee to some grubby, greasy Hollywood bigwig playing tag naked in his office with his secretaries. But if I were to take my couple of minutes of Wikipedia reading and watching videos and condense it into an analogy, it's like a manager at McDonald's, or going further, Ray Kroc to the McDonald's brothers themselves, an agent responsible for expanding the property but ensuring quality and integrity isn't lost. No fried chicken, no more than 2 pickles and the exact right amount of ketchup and mustard per burger. Everything needs to be up to code with what Star Wars was about. Ray Kroc is Dave Filoni, the McDonald's brothers are George Lucas. No fried chicken and exact right amount of mustard in this context means no weird cartoon sidekicks, no gross Pepsi product placement alien to engage in crass commercialism, but unlike the story of the biggest fast food empire, Filoni didn't fuck over Lucas and leave him with nothing but pennies, a button, and a small spool of string. That came later from somebody else. But Clone Wars was consistent with Lucas's mythology. It expanded it, strengthened it, added in new elements that feel inseparable from what we know. It took influences from classic cinema and history, marrying it to the setting and stories that complement the characters in the world. But despite common misconceptions that this was all due to Filoni, I got some bad news, ladies and gentlemen. Filoni did not write any of the greatest episodes of Clone Wars, or really any of it for that matter. Go on IMDb, look up Dave Filoni and get past this weird picture of him with some poor girl who's either a fan, one of the cast, or some poor woman he found on some trafficking website. You'll find that the only writing credits he has prior to Season 7 are additional dialogue for 3 episodes of Season 1 and 1 episode from Season 2 in the capacity of a co-writer. Does this mean he's a fraud? Does this mean he's stealing valor for things he had no hand in? Did you, Typoh YT, just imply earlier that Dave Filoni was a weird cowboy hat wearing pervert who meddles in corners of the universe many would dread to enter? No, I don't think he is. The accused is off the hook for all 3 counts, Your Honor. I don't think Dave Filoni is pulling a Bob Kane. I don't think he's taking credit for work that isn't his. But I do think that Star Wars fans, including myself, vastly overstate Filoni's significance and abilities when you take a step back and look at the whole thing objectively. I and others ride this guy's meat for hours on end, twisting and turning, praising the best parts of things like Clone Wars. Fuck it. But when you take a step back, we really are just cherry picking the best parts, over-exaggerating and overstating this man's position on these projects while forgetting their history, and most importantly, that any medium of entertainment, especially film and TV, is a collaborative process, with no one creative voice rarely being the decisive author behind a project. Many mistakenly refer to Dave Filoni as the creator of the Clone Wars, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The roots of that show go all the way back to 2005, before Revenge of the Sith even came out, with George Lucas sadly realizing that he didn't really get a chance to flesh out and explore this world in conflict he created beyond just a footnote. We never got to see certain stories play out, stories that would be vital to personifying the overall themes of the prequel trilogy and this mythology he endeavored to create. Most importantly, he wanted an expansion that was his, not a part of some comic book he had no input in, not an animated series headed by another visionary like Genndy Tartakovsky. He wanted Clone Wars to be his own. George Lucas is the creator of that show. He wasn't a distant voice that was mostly ignored. He didn't sit back in his mansion raising his 15 kids while Dave Filoni and all the other cast and crew fought for their lives trying to pump out episodes. Lucas was a very notable presence, responsible for fleshing out how the show became what we know it to be today. Filoni's initial pitch for the Clone Wars was almost nothing like what we ended up with. Instead of following characters from the movies, exploring the events that formed who they became, pivotal moments that showcased the strengths and weaknesses of their characters in a way that's more direct and human than the weird and sterile prequels, he wanted the show to basically be Star Wars Rebels, 2 Jedi on a ship with black market smuggler people not overly involved with the overarching events of the conflict, which was changed by George Lucas, thinking it was more interesting to instead follow the characters we know from the movies and see the world through them. After that, Filoni wanted Ahsoka to be mentored by Obi-Wan, only for Lucas to once again course correct by positing it would be way more interesting if her mentor was changed to Anakin, playing with the inherent questions and red flags that premise raises and turning it over the course of 5 seasons into a vital component of the series and its eventual development. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not saying Filoni had no involvement or a negligible involvement. Ahsoka is in large part his creation. He drew the initial concept art, he helped shape the show's art style, and no doubt was a big part of how all these episodes and ideas we love came together. Many like to refer to him as a mini George Lucas. How I was going to do that. Back a couple of months ago I was writing a video on Mandalorian Season 3 where I said that the show's creators were in spirit 2 halves of a George Lucas. One being a big proponent of pushing the boundaries of technology in film, what can be accomplished cinematically on a technical level when given the right tools, and the other being someone who shares the storytelling side, someone enamored with the concept of storycraft, with mythology, with motifs, with how all these different parts of a narrative make a whole and how they resonate with an audience. George Lucas himself would be the the first to tell you that with the Clone Wars he was attempting to foster a successor in Filoni, somebody who shared those sensibilities whilst not being afraid to challenge them, taking this franchise to new and interesting places beyond its creator. The two share a lot in common, but one thing they both share is that their talents are probably much better served as a director or an ideas man than a writer. I have no doubt that Filoni had a lot of great input when it came to the storytelling of something like the Battle of Umbara, giving notes for what arcs the characters should go through and how these moments contextualize their eventual growth. But he was not a writer on it, he was not a director on it. He was probably a powerful voice in the writer's room, but that doesn't change the fact that it was something brought about as a team effort. Was Filoni the most powerful voice there, or was it Lucas who had final say? Was it the actual writer of all 4 episodes, Matt Michnovitz, who is also credited as a writer for some other standout episodes of the show as well as Bad Batch and Jedi Fallen Order? Is Walter Murch worthy of recognition for directing some of the episodes? A guy who's worked on films like Apocalypse Now, a very direct influence for that whole story. This applies to so many other parts of the show. Darth Maul's return was handled amazingly, giving so much dimension and tragedy to a character that was nothing more than a disposable plot device, which in a meta twist of fate was turned into a vital part of his character. But once again, does the credit for that go to Filoni? He didn't write any of those episodes. Lucas was the one insistent that he be brought back, which Filoni did not want. We could play this game forever, there is no shortage of examples I could bring up. The point I'm trying to make is that a supervising director is not equal to being its sole voice and its sole architect. It's definitely his sensibilities we're seeing, his and Lucas's vision being channeled through other directors, writers and animators, but that isn't something they deserve wholesale credit for. And seeing what Filoni has produced without being channeled through a writer's room, co-writer or other collaborator, I put his contribution somewhat into doubt. Filoni has only ever been a writer and director a handful of times, Clone Wars Season 7 and Ahsoka. Two very contrasting projects. The final arc of Clone Wars Season 7 is widely considered the best 4 episodes of the entire show, and that credit is well deserved. It stands as its own story, able to perfectly integrate itself into the wider universe, and doing so with a lot of surprising restraint. You have great action set pieces with bombastic music and camera work, shots that make you feel like you're watching the epic end of an era. But at the same time, its last few episodes are so somber and foreboding. Every decision is very laid out and meticulous. Very little feels done out of convenience or a cheap way to get the plot moving. Every fight is contextualized in some kind of story significance. The focus is narrow, centered only on the characters and how invested we are in seeing how they come out of this impossible, world-shattering situation. It may sound stupid, but I genuinely get emotional seeing the final few moments of these episodes. No dialogue, no large over-the-top set pieces, just somber visuals showing the depth of this era and how after all these years, all these seasons, in the end meant very little. A footnote in a wider story, victory and death. Then we look at Ahsoka, a show that displays that it understands the vague spirit of Star Wars, it gets some of the basics down, but it also just feels so empty. Like, I get it, you got your references to Norse mythology and wolves, we all thought this asshole was going to be a somebody, but you do a little bit of research and he's named after a knight, being possessed by a witch named Morgan. Here's a witch named Morgan and he looks like a knight and he gets cut open and there's an evil green fart cloud in there. People are praising certain shots, the ideas on display, the potential of what they could be, but it all just rings hollow. They're not currently contextualized within any kind of emotion or character or anything meaningful that isn't the most surface level reading ever. Dave Filoni is not a god, he's not infallible, he's not the genius behind what worked about Clone Wars, when that credit can be passed around to the rest of the incredibly talented cast and crew he had around him. The final few episodes of Clone Wars even were in development years before it got brought back for another season, back when Lucas was calling the shots and no doubt had given a couple of treatments beforehand. Uncharitable? Maybe. End of the day, I wasn't sat in the writer's room, I don't know the ins and outs of who did what and what came down to who, but I can see a pattern, that when looking at Filoni's writing work with the exception of Clone Wars, I see things that contain a facsimile of that Star Wars surface. An understanding of what made these movies and stories iconic, but without any spirit or intuition of what makes a good story disconnected from things I know. I'm not calling the guy a fraud or a cynical businessman or anything, he clearly cares a lot about this franchise he's been given the keys to, but there's a big dividing quality between Clone Wars and what he's managed to do independent from any oversight. Ahsoka isn't finished yet, and maybe things will change. All I know is that when I see this shot of Darth Vader, I remember what it represents, that the era of that show has passed, that all the sacrifice, all of what we saw meant nothing in the end. A somber reminder that all the lives we saw, all the individuality we got to see in every one of these clones meant nothing. When I see these shots, I get a similar buzz. They look cool and I can see that whoever is directing has a keen eye for aesthetic, and what looks good as a still frame or a GIF on Twitter. But you know what I feel? Nothing.